I'll just say that even when I was Protestant, when I looked at how strong the evidence was, not based on Catholic scholarship, not based on, as much as I love you guys at Catholic Answers, even when I was Protestant, not even Catholic Answer articles, I was looking at Protestant New Testament scholars, and the evidence that they presented was so overwhelming that I had to change my mind.
Suan Sonna, Catholic Answers affiliate apologist. Thank you for being with us.
I'm glad to be back.
So here's one of those things that comes up a lot in apologetics conversations between Catholics and Protestants, but not only between Catholics and Protestants. This trying to get exactly what it means that Peter is called Peter, meaning the rock, and that Jesus says, "Upon this rock I will build my church." And I have to be kind of honest with you. To Catholics, I think average Catholics, it looks pretty obvious what Jesus is saying there, but the conversations have all kinds of twists and turns. So should we be confident that Jesus is referring to Peter when he says he'll build his church upon this rock?
Yes, and the reason why is, well, I'll go into five reasons why, but I'll just say that even when I was Protestant, when I looked at how strong the evidence was, not based on Catholic scholarship, not based on, as much as I love you guys at Catholic Answers, even when I was Protestant, not even Catholic Answer articles, I was looking at Protestant New Testament scholars, and the evidence that they presented was so overwhelming that I had to change my mind.
Oh, that's very interesting. So it was Protestant scholars of the texts, like who make an examination of the texts and the Greek and the Aramaic and all that. They were coming to this
Mhm.
conclusion.
Yeah, and it's actually, that's actually the first reason why I would say that Peter is the rock. I'm not saying that this is a proof necessarily, but it's more like just a piece of evidence, right? It's a reason to kind of, pay attention. And it's that the consensus of New Testament scholars since the 1970s has been that the person of Peter is the rock of Matthew 16:18. Not his confession, not his faith, not Jesus, the person of Peter.
Okay, so was there a moment or was there an insight that someone had that moved the scholarly consensus in that direction, or is it just that as scholarship progressed, the one side just began to have kind of dispositive weight on it?
I think, Charles Talbert in his 2010 commentary on Matthew, he describes how in 1976 opinion began to shift in identifying Peter as the rock of Matthew 16:18. And what he goes on to mention is that, we had recently discovered this 13th century Jewish midrash. Now, a midrash is like a rabbinic commentary on scripture. And we saw that in Jewish tradition, they had consistently referred to Abraham as the rock on which God had built Israel. And then when you go to like Isaiah chapter 51, verses 1 to 2, it says, "Look to Abraham your father and Sarah your mother. Look to the rock or actually it's the other way around. Look to the rock from which you were hewn and the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father and Sarah your mother." And so there was already a tradition among the Jews, even during the time of Jesus and then consistently afterwards, where they referred to Abraham as the rock.
So this would have been a clear kind of precursor, so to speak, I guess, in Jewish tradition. And you're saying that this commentary, this midrash, was kind of rediscovered in the 1970s, and this is what gave people a new impetus to think this through again?
Well, yeah, what Talbert suggests is that this was kind of the definitive final nail in the coffin
Uh-huh.
that started making people really shift sides. But then you also had really good scholarship in the early 20th century or late 19th century by like Marvin Vincent. And in there, Vincent talks about how the grammar of the passage and just what is natural is the fact that Peter is the rock. It doesn't seem natural to say that Jesus is the rock because, when you think about what Peter's name actually is, we in our English ears we think Peter is Peter, right? And we don't think about what it really means, which is literally rock. And
Yeah.
so, scholars like Michael J. Wilkins, Leander E. Keck, they'll talk about how when we look at what Jesus is saying in Matthew 16:18, especially, Jesus said the phrase originally in Aramaic, to our English ears, it should actually sound like this: "You are rock, and on this rock I will build my church." And when
Yeah.
you put it like that, then you can't miss the pun. You can't miss that,
No.
oh, well, the second rock is very much the first one.
Yeah, right. But also, like, I mean, do people ask the question, why did Jesus change Peter's name at all? Why didn't he just leave his name Simon? If he that would seem to be the dumbest move in the world. And I don't mean this to be a smart aleck comment, but to change Peter's name to Rock and then later make this comment about the rock, but it doesn't refer to Peter. Like, why would you change Peter's name then?
Right. I think that that hypothesis or that interpretation kind of causes unnecessary confusion.
Yeah.
And people talk about, for instance, well, if your interpretation is correct, then it makes Jesus look bad, or it makes Peter look like he's like competing with Christ or something like that. But here, I would actually say that this interpretation would actually make Jesus sound incredibly misleading and kind of tone deaf, right?
Yeah.
It's because it's like you just called a guy rock, and then
Yeah.
you're gonna say on this rock I'll build my church, but then you switched like right in
Yeah.
the middle between those two to something way different.
Okay, but I do want to satisfy those. So you gave us the scholarly consensus that started to change in the 1970s, and now you're saying that it's quite firm, the scholarly consensus that this second reference to the rock refers to Peter.
Yeah.
You talked about how these Jewish traditions around Abraham, particularly, are were helped to form that scholarly consensus. Any other Jewish traditions you want to get to? Because I want to get to a key point, but I don't want to move on too fast.
Well, that's the main one that I
Yeah.
just wanted to emphasize.
Okay. Because I think the thing that really is the convincer for many people is in Greek. Matthew does not give us Jesus saying the same word. He says Petros and Petra. And so
Hmm.
that we do get a linguistic clue. And I think what people will say is, well, Matthew's giving us that linguistic clue in Greek, which would in Aramaic it was probably just you could hear it because of the tone of Jesus's voice. But now Matthew's writing in Greek, he wants us to hear that. And so this is actually quite intentional on Matthew's part that Petra is a different word than Petros.
Yeah, well, and the objections often raised that, if Jesus originally, let's say, spoke in Aramaic this phrase, he would have used for rock, Peter, and rock, the second rock, this rock, he would have used kephas, kephas, right, or
Yeah.
kepha, kepha. And so the two words would have been the same. And so there's this question then on when Matthew wrote his gospel, why does he use in Greek Petros for Peter and then Petra for rock in this rock? And I
Yeah.
think, I recently actually wrote an article about this called "The Rock Explains the Papacy," and I think it's a kind of a brilliant answer because um, I think the basic idea is that in the Greek written form, like when Jesus speaks it, right? When he says "You are rock," okay, we know that rock is Peter, and then upon this rock I'll build my church. Obviously, this rock is now kind of playing on a part of the person of Peter or an aspect of him. And so I use this analogy of, like, for instance, if I say, The Rock is the Rock of the WWE, right? And then I use
Yeah.
two different ways that you could write that out. You could make it both capitalized. So The Rock, capital R, is the Rock, right, of the WWE, which is just kind of like a redundant identity statement.
Yeah. Right.
Whereas you could say The Rock, okay, capital R, is the Rock, lowercase r, of the WWE, which then kind of shows you, okay, he's this foundational figure. He's of some kind of importance. And scholars believe that, when Jesus was using this pun, that's what he meant to say. But when you speak it, right, like when I speak sentence, that first sentence and that second sentence, the same sentence, this different versions of it, however, when I speak it, it sounds exactly the same. And it actually, technically speaking, it's the same word, rock and rock, both times.
Yeah.
But when I write it out, you can see the pun highlighted in written form. And so the words Petros and Petra by Jesus' day were interchangeable, right? They weren't significantly different at all. I mean, I think at most the difference would be something like stone versus rock.
Yeah.
But then
Okay.
D.A. Carson points out in his Expositor's Bible Commentary that's really a poetic distinction. Like you can't really have anything substantially hang upon that difference.
No.
And then I mention other, scholars like Craig Keener who point out, yeah, they were interchangeable by Jesus' day. This is not a significant difference. And
Yeah.
so I think the reason why you have two different words, Petros and Petros, because Petros obviously is a name, refers to a man, but then, you don't want to repeat the same name twice or what could be perceived as the same name twice. So I don't want to use, when I'm
Oh.
writing out The Rock is the Rock of the WWE, two capital R's.
So that would explain Matthew's choice to say Petra the second time. It's
Mhm.
you actually are preserving the pun there. You're not destroying the pun.
Right. And this is actually the explanation that's been offered by, D.A. Carson in the Expositor's Bible Commentary, W.D. Davies and Dale Allison. They cite Joseph Fitzmyer and other scholars to show that, this is probably the best explanation for why, Matthew switches between these two words, even though they're interchangeable.
Okay, all right, but if that linguistic little quirk linguistically has a simple explanation like that, there is still some conflict over the word "this." So I
Hmm.
almost feel like sometimes people imagine it going, "Thou art Peter," pointing at Peter, and on this rock, like pointing back at himself. Some people like on me, or I don't know how you would do it if it means Peter's confession of faith, but that the this somehow it has an unclarity to it that makes us not want to say that you're the rock, and on this rock that the this refers to Peter himself.
Well, all these hypotheses that, maybe like Jesus pointed to himself the second time, right?
Yeah.
So maybe he said, "You are Peter," right? And then he says, "And on this rock I'll build my church," or something like that. These are all speculation. They're not founded in the text. And so one of the things that we want to do when we're interpreting scripture is to kind of, employ a kind of textualism where we remain as faithful as we can to the text. And if the author doesn't say, for instance, "Oh yeah, and Jesus was pointing to himself or pointing to Peter," then we shouldn't start inferring that. That's speculation. Whereas the Catholic interpretation really is the simplest explanation in the fact that it's the most natural and it takes the text as it is. It doesn't try to do further speculation and it just preserves what seems to be the clear intent of Jesus. Um, and so I think that's one way that you can deal with the question. But I
Uh,
remember there's another part and I want to make sure I got to it.
I guess it just had to do with what is the word "this" referring to, that
Right.
people will say
Yeah.
that that's ambiguous.
Yeah, and so Marvin Vincent, who's a Protestant scholar, writing I think over 100 years ago, he actually has this brilliant quote in his book, Word Studies in the New Testament. So I'm just going to read it. He says this quote: "The reference of Petra, Petra is the Greek word for the second rock. So for Peter, it's Petros. For this rock, it's Petra. The reference of Petra to Christ is forced and unnatural. The obvious reference of the word Petra is to Peter. The emphatic this, as in upon this rock, naturally refers to the nearest antecedent, Peter.
Oh, yeah.
And besides, the metaphor is thus weakened since Christ appears here not as the foundation, but as the architect. On this rock I will build my church."
Oh, yes. What a weird metaphor it would be if he's both the rock and the builder.
Right. Hmm.
I see. Very interesting. Um, well, so in Aramaic, that we wouldn't have had two words. We would have had just one. What about the question about in the Greek language for Matthew? Matthew is making a choice here. I mean, every writer with every word they make, in a certain sense, is making a choice. So, did he have other choices of how he could have conveyed the word rock if he wanted to make a clearer distinction?
Yes, and we actually know what Greek word he would have used, and it would have been the Greek word lithos. And so I just want to quote to you from D.A. Carson again. So D.A. Carson says this: "Had Matthew wanted to say no more than that Peter was a stone in contrast with Jesus the rock, the more common word would have been lithos, stone of almost any size. Then there would have been no pun. And that is just the point, that there is a pun. And so he uses two words that are so virtually identical, Petros and Petra, that it allows him to preserve the pun rather than using lithos, because then lithos would have broken the pun."
I see. Okay. So my objections at least the objections that I'm familiar with are dwindling. As a matter of fact, I don't think that I can think of any more
Hmm.
objections. But I guess that is your key point that you're making is, at least in the community of Bible scholars, not many people are making objections anymore. This is more or less settled in the scholarly realm, but that maybe that hasn't permeated out into the more popular understanding.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty shocking because I thought when I was, a Baptist, good Baptist investigating the scriptures, that there was widespread confusion and debate on whether or not the rock of Matthew 16:18 is Christ or Peter or his confession. And then I started reading, good conservative scholars like Craig Keener, like D.A. Carson, and I started realizing, wait a minute, no, this has been settled for a long time. And it just amazed me that a lot of mainstream Protestants weren't simply aware of this consensus. Now, of course, when you go through the literature, you will find scholars here and there who will still try to say it's Peter's confession or it's maybe Christ. You'll see that from time to time. But that has become so rare nowadays
Hmm.
that it doesn't really threaten that there is a consensus. And even, the scholars who do kind of try to say it's like Peter's confession, or who do try to say it's like it's Christ, they will usually admit in a footnote that they are in the extreme minority on this particular question.
Okay, so let's say we treat that as settled then, just for a moment.
Hmm.
I mean, that's a different question than is Christ establishing the papacy at this
Mm.
moment? And so, I mean, I want to say that and just get your take on that, because I don't. It seems to me that a Protestant person, and I would guess that the ongoing Protestantism of these scholars would suggest this as well, that you could concede that Christ is giving Peter himself a special role here without having to concede everything to the Catholic Church. Now, admittedly, I think you should concede to the Catholic Church. I think the Catholic Church is true, and it is the
Hmm.
church that Christ founded. But I feel like maybe that would take the temperature down a little bit if this wasn't a desperate moment for the Protestant person looking at this.
Yeah, I think that when it comes to this particular observation, right? I think it is true that if you concede that the person of Peter is the rock of Matthew 16:18, it doesn't automatically get you to the papacy.
Yeah.
But it certainly doesn't hurt the
No.
Catholic case.
Right.
It also doesn't hurt
Right.
that as Catholics, we've been saying this for a long time. And then finally, Protestant New Testament scholarship, or I shouldn't just say Protestant New Testament scholarship, but just New Testament scholarship in general, and especially among Protestant New Testament scholars, they agree now with the Catholic exegesis of this passage. And in fact, when you read some of their commentaries, they ferociously defend it. And they're saying, guys, we got to stop saying that the person of Peter is not the rock. So, for instance, Oscar Kuhlmann, the Lutheran scholar, and then in the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, he says Roman Catholic exegesis is correct, and all Protestant attempts to evade this interpretation are to be rejected. That's
Yeah.
kind of paraphrasing him just a little
It's
bit,
pretty
right?
clear. Yeah.
Um,
Right. Right. I see what you're saying, though, but so that it's going to bear weight because there were two different claims, and if it's settled on the one claim, then you have to let go of the other one, and so it does have a certain kind of emotional power or heat around it.
mm,
But what maybe a more profitable thing to do would be, well, first of all, not to base your biblical interpretations on trying to prove somebody else wrong. Just
mm.
listen to what the Bible actually says. And two, maybe we could begin to dialogue together about, well, what does that mean then? If Christ said this about Peter, what's the meaning of that? And I'm sure that we'd have many disagreements on that, but at least we'd have a more productive conversation.
Right. We're talking now about the person of Peter. And so, what about Peter, right? And then, when you think about the fact that rocks in Jewish tradition are known to be everlasting, reliable foundations,
Hmm.
foundations that don't move, that remain, then it's like, in what sense then does Peter remain in the church? In what sense does Peter continue to be that foundation? And so, then we eventually that starts boiling into a larger conversation on the primacy of Peter. Because I think also it surprises me that there are a lot of mainstream Protestants who will say, "Oh, but Peter's just one disciple among the others. He's not. There's nothing special about him." And then you also see in the scholarship, all of them, all the scholars saying basically, "No, I mean Peter was clearly the leader of the 12. or at least the chief spokesman, he clearly had a primacy of some sort, right? And it's like, well, at this point, then we're getting closer and closer to the papacy. And, a lot of scholars will point out that they think, in the first 12 chapters of the book of Acts, you see how Peter really is the dominant figure of the church. And I love how Jimmy Akin, in his debate with Stephen Nimesh, he said that, Peter was a lion for the church, right? And I just love that image because it really shows that, the Peter who had denied Jesus and then had been reinstituted into service, he got his act together, he matured, and he became the foundation that the church needed him to be. I mean, you have the baptism of Cornelius, you have him preaching the first sermon, you have him supervising over the successor to Judas. You have all these examples. Oh, declaring judgment on Ananias and Sapphira,
Right.
one of the few times that God actually kills someone in the New Testament. And you see very clearly that there is something distinct and unique about Peter, and that he is this image of unity and strength in the church. And so at that point, then you start getting closer and closer, I think, to not just, I don't know, Peter being first among equals, but he really was a leader.
But it's now, and I'll probably close with this unless you spark something else in me. There, you can read Scripture. I mean, Scripture, these things happen on many levels, or they present us with many levels of interpretation. And certainly it would be also fair to say, in addition to everything that you just said, that Peter's story is meant also to be a demonstration for the individual believer, that we're to be like Peter. We're to see in Peter's story our own story, so that when Jesus says to Peter, "You're the rock," though we may say that there's an ecclesiastical kind of meaning to that, but there's also, to each of us, Christ wants to build upon us. There is some. Protestants are not foolish when they personalize the story of Jesus. It's just that's not all of the levels. They're not exhausting all the levels. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, when people talk about how they think that, when they want to emphasize that the confession of Peter is what Christ built the church on, what it's implied there is that they also want to say, and we too can be the foundation of the church, right? Through having that same confession. And I mean, if you think about it, though, I think that's a valid interpretation, but it's not, I guess, the most direct intention of Christ.
Okay.
It can be a secondary intention, it can be a secondary meaning, but what's the primary meaning? Well, the primary meaning is that the person of Peter is the rock, and he's going to have this foundational role in the church. And then we can look upon that confession, because it's through the confession, right, that he is named rock. He goes from Simon to Peter. And then from there, one thing that we have to watch out for is this kind of, I guess, like, Sunday homily hermeneutic, right? Where, for instance, we say, and Jesus rose again from the dead, just as, Jesus can raise up our dreams from the dead and can raise up our hopes. And, it's like, no, that's beautiful. That's good. And that's how the fathers also, wanted to expand the meaning of the text, right? But you can't use that expansion as if that is if that is equal in level to the primary meaning or intention and the textual structure that's there. And so I think we need to emphasize both without overemphasizing the secondary meaning.
Gotcha. Yeah, beautifully said. Suan Sonna, I always enjoy the conversations with you. Thanks for doing this one with us. I think this will be very helpful to lots of people. I hope it will promote dialogue rather than shut off dialogue. I know that you have the same hope, but I'm very grateful to you. Thank you for the time you spent with us.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
One thing I've always appreciated about the apologists here at Catholic Answers is that when someone calls up and tries to make an apologetics case using a particular verse of Scripture, when that is not actually what that verse of Scripture says or implies, they'll just straighten them out on it and say, no, don't use that to defend the Catholic faith, because that's not what the Scripture itself intends. And I get the sense from that conversation with Suan that more and more Protestant scholars, apologists for Protestantism, Protestant Bible scholars, are saying that. And it would be good if we could maybe move beyond this now, because it's not an issue that once it's settled, it settles everything. But I think out of respect for the Lord and for Matthew, who wrote that gospel, if the meaning is clear, we should just say the meaning is clear, and then we can discuss what does it mean that that's what Jesus said and that that's what Jesus did. Hope you enjoyed this episode. If you'd like to give us a comment on it or maybe suggest a future episode, you can always just send us an email. focus@catholic.com is our email address, focus@catholic.com. If you'd like to support us, please go to Give Catholic and give whatever you like. There's a $5 million limit. Please do not go over $5 million. GiveCatholic.com. When you give, leave a little note that says that you're giving it for Catholic Answers Focus. If you want to follow us on YouTube, we're over there. Go to CatholicAnswersFocus.com, and then you can just click on the YouTube link and you get all the episodes that we've got loaded up over there at YouTube. If you wouldn't mind, hit the little bell, subscribe. We're growing. I think we've tripled in the last few months of our subscribers over on YouTube, so do that a couple more times, and I don't know, that'll be everybody on Earth pretty soon. And if you want to get us on podcasts, you can get us wherever you get a podcast. Maybe Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, whatever you use. Just subscribe there. Then you'll be notified when new episodes are available. I'm Cy Kellett, your host. Thanks again to Suan Sonna for taking the time with us. Thank you for taking the time with us. We appreciate that you do. We'll see you next time, God willing, right here on Catholic Answers Focus.